This is completely unacceptable behavior in this community. I demand that you move this vehicle immediately or face the consequences.
I didn't raise my voice when the HOA president stood in the middle of the road, hands on her hips, screaming about property damage and criminal intent while pointing at what used to be her daily shortcut through my front yard. Let her finish. I waited until the shouting attracted a few neighbors, the way it always did when she wanted an audience. Then I reached into my truck, pulled out a folded county-approved site diagram laminated in clear plastic, and handed it to the sheriff's deputy she'd insisted on calling. The deputy studied it for a long time, longer than she liked, then looked up and asked her if she was aware that she'd been driving over a legally protected roadside installation for the last 8 months. The silence that followed was the loudest sound I'd heard in years. Before all of that, before surveys and permits and deputies standing in the grass with their boots exactly where she wasn't allowed to be anymore, my life had been aggressively unremarkable. I bought the house because it was quiet, because the road dead-ended, because the mornings smelled like wet dirt and pine instead of exhaust. I was coming off a long stretch of work that burned me out in ways I didn't talk about, and I wanted something slow and predictable. The mailbox was original, an old metal one mounted on a wooden post my father would have approved of, set back just enough from the road to avoid snowplows and clipped mirrors. I checked the mail every afternoon, around 4, waved at the same 2 neighbors, and went back inside. I wasn't trying to make a statement. I was trying to disappear into routine. The first time the mailbox got hit, I assumed it was an accident. It leaned slightly, the door hung crooked, and there was a tire mark in the dirt that cut across the edge of my lawn. I straightened it, tamped the soil back down, and didn't give it another thought. Rural roads are forgiving that way. People misjudge turns. Things happen. The second time, the box was flattened, bent inward like someone had punched it with a bumper. This time, there was no apology note, no pause, just fresh tracks leading back toward the corner house where the HOA president lived. I still didn't connect the dots. I replaced it again, heavier this time, mounted deeper. I told myself I was over-engineering a simple problem because that's what I do. 2 weeks later, I came home to a violation notice taped to my door. It cited improper roadside structure placement and referenced an HOA guideline I'd never heard of. The fine was small but smug, written in bold with a compliance deadline that assumed guilt instead of discussion. I emailed the address listed at the bottom, attached photos, asked politely which bylaw applied to mailboxes regulated by federal placement standards. I got no response. What I did get 3 days later was another destroyed mailbox. This one had been hit hard enough to shear the post clean off at ground level. That was the moment something shifted, not emotionally, but operationally. I stopped reacting and started documenting. I took photographs from multiple angles, measured distances from the road edge, pulled the county right-of-way maps from the public records site. I learned more about mailbox placement law in a weekend than I ever wanted to know. What surprised me wasn't that the HOA was wrong. It was how wrong they were, and how confident they seemed being that wrong. When I requested a meeting, they scheduled it and then canceled an hour before. When I sent certified letters, they were signed for and ignored. The fines continued, escalating in tidy increments that suggested a template more than a judgment. By the time I realized the mailbox wasn't the real issue, I was already too far in to pretend otherwise. The president had been cutting across my yard daily to shave 10 seconds off her drive. My mailbox was in the way. Instead of adjusting her turn, she treated it like an obstacle that would eventually learn. And because she ran the HOA like a personal extension of her will, she assumed that paperwork could substitute for permission. That assumption was the mistake. I pulled the original subdivision plat from the county archive, the one recorded before the HOA ever existed. I requested the transportation easement records, the utility overlays, the roadside protection ordinances tied to rural delivery routes. None of it was dramatic. It was slow, boring, and exact. The kind of work people don't think to do because they assume someone else already has. What I found was simple. My mailbox wasn't just compliant, it was protected, and the strip of land she'd been driving over wasn't common property. It was mine, reinforced by statute, mapped, and quietly immune to HOA authority. When the board finally convened the emergency meeting they claimed I'd forced, I brought everything in a single binder. No speeches. No accusations. Just documents in chronological order. I didn't need to explain much. Their lawyer did that for me, his voice getting flatter with every page he turned. By the time the president realized the fines were invalid, the damage claims were documented, and her shortcut constituted repeated trespass against protected infrastructure, it was too late to pretend this was a misunderstanding. Now there's a new installation where the mailbox used to be. It's not flashy. Most people don't notice it until they're too close. But it's county-approved, survey-aligned, and immovable. She doesn't drive that way anymore. No one does. And when I check the mail at 4 in the afternoon, it's quiet again, the way it was always supposed to be. Before any of this turned into a legal exercise or a lesson in how fragile assumed authority can be, my days followed a rhythm so predictable, it almost felt intentional. I chose this place because nothing about it demanded attention. The house sat far enough back from the road to feel private but not isolated, with a shallow ditch that filled with rainwater in the spring and dried into cracked clay by late summer. Mornings were slow. I drank my coffee on the back steps and listened to birds argue over the fence line, watched delivery trucks pass without stopping, and felt grateful that my biggest decision before noon was whether to mow or wait another day. I wasn't trying to assert ownership over anything beyond my own time. I had no interest in boards, committees, or neighborhood politics. The HOA existed somewhere in the background, like an appliance you never think about until it makes a noise. The mailbox was part of that background comfort. It was the same one that had been there when I first toured the property, dented but solid, with a faint outline where an old number decal had once been. I liked that it looked ordinary. It did its job without asking for maintenance beyond the occasional tightening of a bolt. Every afternoon, I walked down the short gravel path, opened it, sorted the mail, and walked back. Bills, county notices, the occasional handwritten envelope from someone who still believed in stamps. It anchored the day. It told me I was home, that the world knew where to find me but didn't insist on more than that. My neighbors, for the most part, mirrored that same quiet agreement. We waved, we nodded, we borrowed tools without paperwork. There was an understanding that people had come here to be left alone. Even the HOA rules, sparse as they were, seemed designed to preserve that calm rather than interfere with it. Grass height, fence colors, things that mattered only if someone tried very hard to care. I assumed, naively as it turned out, that leadership reflected that culture, that anyone willing to volunteer for the role understood restraint as part of the job. I didn't attend meetings. I didn't read newsletters. I paid dues automatically and forgot about them. When I thought about the future, it was in small personal terms. Fixing the shed roof before winter. Planting something along the fence that wouldn't need much water. Letting the place age with me rather than against me. There was no sense of looming conflict, no warning signs dramatic enough to register. If there had been, I might have paid closer attention to the way the corner house treated the road or how certain tire tracks cut the turn a little too tight. At the time, it all blended into the scenery. That sense of peace wasn't dramatic, and that's why it mattered. It was. Earned by years of choosing quiet over convenience, distance over involvement. I didn't move there to win anything. I moved there to stop competing. Which is why, when the first violation notice appeared and the mailbox started turning into a recurring problem, it felt less like an inconvenience and more like an intrusion. Not because it was loud or aggressive, but because it was unnecessary. It disrupted something that had been working just fine without supervision. Looking back, that contrast is what still stands out to me. Not the anger or the eventual satisfaction, but the simplicity of what I was trying to protect. I wasn't defending a principle or making a stand. I was defending a routine, a quiet life that didn't ask for permission. And at the time, I genuinely believed that explaining that calmly would be enough. The first time it happened, I honestly assumed it was an accident. I came home from the grocery store and noticed the mailbox leaning at an angle that felt wrong in a way only something familiar can. The post wasn't snapped cleanly, just cracked low to the ground, as if something heavy had clipped it without stopping. I straightened it as best I could, tamped the soil back down with my foot, and told myself it was just one of those things that happens when people take turns too fast or misjudge the edge of the road. 2 days later, that was when the note appeared in my mailbox instead of inside it. A thin white slip from the HOA citing improper roadside installation and non-compliant placement creating a hazard, complete with a fine and a warning that future violations would escalate. It was surreal to be fined for something that had been hit twice by the same vehicle that everyone in the neighborhood already knew belonged to the HOA president, who lived on the corner and routinely treated the turn like her own private racetrack. I remember standing there longer than necessary, holding that notice and looking from the paper to the damaged post, trying to reconcile how any of this made sense. The mailbox hadn't moved since before I bought the house. It sat well within the county's right-of-way specifications, the same distance from the curb as every other box on the road. There were no reflectors missing, no obstructions, nothing new or unusual about it, except that it had recently been run over. When it happened a third time, less than a week later, the confusion gave way to something colder. The post was shattered completely, the box crushed flat enough that the mail carrier left my letters in a plastic bag at the end of the driveway. Another notice followed, this one more sharply worded, warning me that continued non-compliance could result in corrective action taken by the association at my expense. There was no acknowledgement of the damage, no curiosity about why a stationary object kept ending up under someone's tires. Just blame, neatly typed, and officially stamped. What unsettled me most wasn't the inconvenience or even the fine. It was the casual certainty with which responsibility was reassigned. The HOA president drove past my house twice a day. I had seen her tires drift over the edge of the pavement more times than I could count. Neighbors had joked about it. Yet, on paper, I was the problem. I hadn't confronted anyone. I hadn't raised it at a meeting. I was still operating under the assumption that this was a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a short explanation. But the tone of those notices, especially the last one, made it clear that no explanation had been requested. A conclusion had already been reached, and I had been assigned my role in it without consultation. Standing there with splintered wood at my feet and a fine in my hand, I felt less angry than displaced, like I'd stepped into a story where the facts no longer mattered as much as who was allowed to define them. I still tried to handle it the normal way, because at that point, I genuinely believed normal behavior would be met with the same. I emailed the HOA office first, attaching photos of the damaged mailbox from multiple angles, including wide shots that clearly showed its placement relative to the road and the painted edge line. I cited the county right-of-way ordinance by number, copied directly from the municipal website, and pointed out that the box had been installed years earlier in compliance with USPS and county standards. I kept the tone neutral, almost apologetic, as if I were interrupting someone important to ask a small favor. When I didn't hear back after a few days, I followed up with a shorter message, asking whether the fines could be paused until the damage issue was addressed. That one went unanswered too. Instead, I received a certified letter informing me that the association would be taking corrective measures if the violation was not resolved within 10 days, with all costs billed to my account. No acknowledgement of my emails. No reference to the photos. Just a deadline and a dollar amount. I requested to attend the next board meeting, assuming that a face-to-face conversation would clear up what email apparently could not. I was told I could attend, but that the agenda was full, and my issue would be addressed as time permitted. When the night came, I sat in the folding chair at the back of the room and listened to discussions about lawn ornaments and parking. Decals while my name sat at the bottom of the page like an afterthought. When my turn finally came, I explained calmly and briefly that the mailbox had been struck multiple times by the same vehicle and that I was being fined for damage I didn't cause. I didn't accuse anyone by name. I didn't raise my voice. I simply asked what the process was for resolving that. The response was a tight smile and a reminder that homeowners are responsible for maintaining compliant structures, followed by a suggestion that perhaps I should move the mailbox farther, back to avoid future incidents. That was the moment something shifted. Not because they disagreed with me, but because they dismissed the premise entirely. The problem wasn't the car hitting the mailbox. The problem was that my mailbox existed where it had always existed, and moving it would be easier than questioning the person driving. After that meeting, the notices escalated. The fines increased. A contractor's estimate appeared in my mailbox for the removal and replacement of the post, pre-approved by the HOA, with a line at the bottom stating that failure to comply would result in automatic billing. Neighbors who had once waved now avoided eye contact, not out of hostility, but out of a quiet desire not to be involved. I could feel the boundaries tightening, the unspoken understanding that pushing back would make me the difficult one, regardless of the facts. That's when I stopped sending emails designed to be polite and started saving everything instead. Every notice, every envelope, every time-stamped photograph went into a folder. I printed copies. I labeled dates. I stopped expecting fairness and started preparing for precision. It wasn't anger that drove that change, but clarity. I understood then that this wasn't a misunderstanding waiting to be resolved. It was a pattern, and patterns don't break on their own. Once I accepted that this wasn't going to resolve itself through courtesy, my focus narrowed in a way that surprised me. I pulled the property file from the county recorder's office. First, the full packet with plats, easements, and the original roadway dedication language, because mailboxes live in a peculiar legal space that most people assume they understand but rarely do. I learned quickly that the strip along the road wasn't HOA controlled in the way the notices implied. It was governed by a combination of county right-of-way standards and federal postal regulations that dictated height, setback, and breakaway requirements. I printed the relevant sections from the USPS Domestic Mail Manual, highlighted the passages on approved supports, and cross-referenced them with the county ordinance that specified impact resistance limits for roadside fixtures. At night, after dinner, I laid everything out on the table and read it slowly, not looking for a loophole but for certainty. The more I read, the clearer it became that I wasn't required to move the mailbox back, nor was I obligated to accept responsibility for repeated vehicular strikes caused by negligent driving. I started documenting with intention. I set up a small weatherproof camera aimed at the corner, not to provoke anything, but to establish a record. I measured distances with a tape and photographed the results next to a dated newspaper. I requested the incident logs from the HOA for any reported roadway hazards on our street and noted the absence of any mention of my mailbox prior to the fines. I filed a public records request with the county for maintenance complaints on that curve, which came back showing multiple informal remarks over the years about drivers cutting it too close. Neighbors grew quieter when they saw me taking notes, and my partner asked more than once whether this was worth the stress. I told them, I wasn't escalating anything. I was stabilizing it. There's a difference. One is about emotion. The other is about making sure that when the next notice arrived, it would land on a desk already stacked with facts. By the time I ordered a replacement mailbox, the decision had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with compliance. I selected a model explicitly approved by the county, installed on a support designed to meet breakaway standards while remaining structurally sound under normal conditions. I followed the installation guide to the letter, documenting each step, each measurement, each inspection sticker. I even scheduled a brief site visit from a county inspector, who signed off without hesitation and reminded me, almost casually, that drivers are expected to maintain control of their vehicles regardless of roadside features. I filed that report with my growing folder and waited. The waiting was the hardest part. Not because I feared what would happen next, but because I knew with a calm certainty that the pattern would repeat itself. And when it did, it would no longer be my word against theirs. It would be the record. When it happened again, it unfolded exactly the way I expected, which is to say, quietly and without drama. The new mailbox didn't splinter or bend the way the old one had. It stayed where it was, aligned and intact, while the vehicle that struck, it came to rest at an angle that made the curve look suddenly less forgiving. I wasn't outside when it happened. I didn't rush down the driveway or confront anyone. By the time I walked out, the scene had already shifted into something procedural, with a patrol car idling nearby and the HOA president standing on the shoulder, arms crossed, explaining very confidently how a non-compliant installation had caused the incident. I listened without interrupting, handed the officer the county inspection report and the installation documentation, and watched the tone change as he read. There was a pause, then a second look at the mailbox, then a question about whether the HOA had authorized any changes to the roadway. That was the moment the story stopped being about my property and started being about their assumptions. The board called an emergency meeting 2 nights later. I knew because the notice appeared in my inbox, with an urgency none of my earlier emails had ever inspired. I attended, not out of obligation, but because this was the point I had been preparing for. When my turn came, I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I placed the folder on the table and opened it methodically, walking through the timeline in the same order I had lived it. The original installation photos, the fines, the certified letters, the county ordinances, the USPS regulations, the inspection, sign-off, the incident report from the patrol officer noting driver error. Finally, I played the footage from the camera, slowed just enough to show the vehicle cutting the turn and leaving the pavement before contact. The room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with respect and everything to do with realization. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was a documented sequence of decisions, and every one of them pointed away from me. The HOAs. Attorney asked a few questions, carefully worded and noticeably narrower than before. I answered them directly, sticking to dates and documents. When the president attempted to redirect the conversation toward community standards, the attorney stopped her mid-sentence and asked to see the inspection report again. That was when the dynamic shifted completely. The fines were withdrawn on the spot. The prior notices were reclassified as administrative errors. A motion was made, seconded, and passed to suspend enforcement actions related to roadside fixtures pending a full review. No one looked at me while it happened, which was fine. The point wasn't to be seen. The point was that the paper now said what reality had been saying all along. I gathered my folder, thanked them for their time, and left before anyone could reframe it into something smaller than it was. After that meeting, things didn't explode or unravel in some dramatic public way. They simply corrected themselves. Within a month, the HOA president resigned, citing personal reasons, and the board quietly brought in an interim replacement who made a point of reintroducing himself to homeowners with a carefully worded letter about transparency and cooperation. The attorney I had met at the meeting sent a brief follow-up confirming that my account balance had been zeroed out and that all prior violation notices related to the mailbox had been formally voided. There was no apology, but there was something better than that: silence. No more envelopes taped to posts. No more warnings dressed up as authority. The curve by my house even received a small reflective marker from the county a few weeks later, installed without comment, as if it had always been planned that way. The neighborhood adjusted in subtle ways. A few people who had avoided me started, waving again, tentative at first, then with relief. One neighbor stopped by to mention, almost in passing, that the corner turn had always been dangerous and that it was good someone finally sorted it out. Others said nothing at all, which was also fine. Respect doesn't always arrive with words. Sometimes it shows up as space. The HOA meetings grew shorter. The newsletters became bland. Rules that had once been enforced selectively were suddenly applied evenly or not at all. It was as though the association had remembered what it was supposed to be in the first place and decided not to test the boundaries again. At home, the rhythm returned. I walked down the gravel path in the afternoons and opened a mailbox that stood straight and unremarkable, doing its job without commentary. The camera came down, the folder went into a drawer. My partner slept better. I stopped thinking in terms of strategy and started thinking again about small repairs and weekend plans. The conflict didn't leave behind a sense of triumph so much as a restored normalcy, which was all I had ever wanted. I hadn't set out to teach anyone a lesson. I had set out to protect a routine, and in doing so, I learned how quickly assumed power collapses when it meets a record that refuses to blink. Now, when I drive past that corner, I slow down out of habit, not caution. The mailbox is still there, exactly where it belongs, and no one has suggested otherwise. The HOA exists, technically, but it stays in its lane, and that's the quiet truth I keep coming back to. Authority that needs to be enforced through intimidation is usually paper thin. All it takes is patience, documentation, and the willingness to let facts speak longer than voices. Everything else tends to move out of the way on its own.